Hi! In this video I want to show you how I use VCA tracks and group tracks in Cubase and when I would use a VCA track versus a group track. So let's go! Okay, so a few weeks ago I released a new video in the song production series about producing the piano tracks, which I'll link up here. And in that video I also go into a bit more detail about project organization. Because the tracks, I'm getting more and more tracks in the project, and I explain how I organize those tracks with group tracks and folder tracks in Cubase. Based on that video I got a question from Anthony Stoll. What are the advantages of making a group rather than a VCA? Love the videos. Well, thanks Anthony, always great to hear. And even though I replied to your question, I figured let's make a video about it because there's a bit more to it. So VCA tracks were introduced in Cubase 8. And they're really based on a facility that was part of hardware mixing consoles, where you could control the level of multiple faders by one fader, by means of a voltage controlled amplifier. There is actually a very nice Sound on Sound article when VCA faders were introduced, so I will link that in the description below. Now, group tracks have been part of Cubase for a much longer time. With group tracks you actually change the routing of your other audio channels, so you send them to the group, and you can do much more with them, which I'll go into in a minute. Now I must say I've been using Cubase from way before VCA channels were introduced, so I almost automatically go to group tracks when I want to control multiple tracks at the same time. However, there's definitely a use for VCA tracks as well, which I'll go into. Now I have a little example project in Cubase which I want to use for this demonstration, and it's actually the drum tracks. Well, it's the basic drum tracks of one of our upcoming Wash songs. It's called High on Love. It will be released September 18th. So depending on when you watch this video, you may already be able to hear the track in full. But in this project you can basically see that I have two kick tracks, two snare tracks, a hi-hat track and an overhead track. And they're all together in a folder track called Drums. So let's hear the individual tracks so you have an idea of what it is. First all together and then I'll solo the single tracks. Yeah, so some basic recorded drum tracks. We actually have more drum tracks in the full project, but I'll show you that in some other video. Now, if you look at this project in the mixer, you can see that currently you only have faders for every individual audio track, and there's no way to control the drums in total or separately control the snare or kick, for example. You just have to adjust the individual faders to get the level that you want, which is not ideal in a mix. Okay, so now let's add VCA tracks to separately control the snare, the kick and the drums in total. So I select the kick and the external kick track and I go add VCA track to selected channels. I do the same thing here for the snare. Add track, add VCA track to selected channels, and I also want a total for the drums, so that means I want to control this VCA track for the kick, the snare VCA track and the other two remaining tracks which are not put together. Add VCA track to selected channels. So now I want to rename this to kick. This one controls my snare and this is for the drums in total. So if you now have a look at the mixer, you can see that the VCA tracks are in green and these control the kick, these control the snare, and these control everything. However, the naming is not ideal yet, because what Cubase actually does, it has added a VCA track, but it has also added so-called link groups. And I want to make sure that those link groups are also named accordingly. So this link group is called kick and it's controlled by the kick VCA fader. This link group is called snare, controlled by the snare VCA fader. And this link group is called drums, controlled by the drums VCA fader. So if we now play the drum track again, you can see that I can vary the individual elements. Yeah, so all of this works great for volume control. What it also works for is for muting, soloing, listening, enabling record, monitor. But what you also see is some other facilities are not available. For example, you see over here that you cannot add inserts to a VCA track or sends. There's also no panning like you have in regular audio channels. So it's a bit limited. And I want to show you what this configuration would look like with group tracks. Now for that, we first need to remove the VCA tracks. Remove this as well. And now you might think you're done, but that's not actually the case. If you now look at the mixer, you can see that there's still link groups because you've removed tracks, but you have not actually removed the link groups. So if you now look at the kick link group, you can see that none of the parameters of these channels are actually linked, so it doesn't really matter that there's a kick link group, but I'm going to remove it anyway. Okay, so now we're back to the state with no link groups and no VCA faders. Okay, now for group tracks, we can do the same thing as with VCA tracks. We can just add them to the channels that we want to be able to control together. So over here you can say add track, group channel to selected tracks. Since these are two mono kick tracks, I want to have a mono configuration here. I'm going to name this group kick. I can do the same thing for the snare. Add group channel to selected tracks, also mono. And I also want to bus kick, snare, the heads and the overhead together in a stereo channel this time for the drums in total. Now if you now look at the mixer, you can see that there are group channels available that can now control the volume. You can see that they work in a different way, because when I move the group fader, it doesn't actually move any of the other faders. So you can see that the other channels all end up in the drum group, and then I can control the drum group level by using the drum group fader. Now the advantage of these group tracks is that you can do more with them than with VCA tracks. You basically have the same controls as for all normal audio channels. For example, you have a panner, you can pan them left, right. And you also have insert and send effects available for them. For example, I might want to put a nice SSL equalizer on the total that I can use to maybe pull out a little bit of 800, which is rarely a good frequency for drums, and maybe add a little sheen on top. And for the snare, I may want to send it to a nice snare reverb, so that I can get some reverb on the snare. So this kind of processing you will not be able to do with just VCA tracks. However, you're going to notice that there's also a bit of a disadvantage to these group channels, because listen to what happens when I decrease the overall drum level now. Yeah, so what's happening is when I want to decrease the total level of the drums in the mix, then that works fine, except the snare gets sent to the snare reverb without being affected by this group channel. Because how much level gets sent to the snare reverb is only affected by this group fader. And that's staying in place, so that's a big disadvantage. So this means when I vary the group fader for the drums in total, I get a different effects level for all the effects that I have as sends on my individual tracks, which is not what I want. So how I usually solve this is by adding a VCA track in addition to the group channel. So I'm going here, VCA track, to select the channels. I can give it a slightly different name to make sure that it's the VCA track. And if I now go back to the mixer, you can see I will also rename this one. You can see over here that if I now vary the volume, the snare group channel goes down as well, which means that the reverb will also go down. So now the reverb and the snare level will basically stay in sync. Let's listen to that. Nicely the way I want it. So how I handle this in the mix is if I want to vary the total drum level, I will use the VCA fader. And I will not touch the group fader at all. The only thing I now use the group channel for is for inserts and sends, and maybe panning if I wanted to. But for volume control, I would use the VCA track. So that's what I wanted to show you about how I use VCA and group channels and when I use which type. So thanks again for watching this video. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. And if you like it or find it useful, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and ring the little bell icon if you want to know when I post another video. See you soon.